The year is 1978. Elderly Austrian psychologist Viktor Frankl is giving a lecture at a New York university. Suddenly, whistles are heard from the audience, and some begin calling Frankl a Nazi pig. These were very strange accusations. After all, Viktor was Jewish and had not escaped Nazi persecution during World War II. He spent 3 years in German concentration camps, lost his loved ones there, and only miraculously managed to survive. Viktor Frankl was born at the dawn of the 20th century, in March 1905, in Vienna, one of the two capitals of the then Austro-Hungarian Empire. Already in early childhood, our hero realized that he wanted to become a doctor, and in his youth, he became specifically interested in psychoanalysis and corresponded with none other than Sigmund Freud himself. Viktor definitely hit the nail on the head with his choice of future profession, because at that time, there was no more suitable place on earth than his hometown to become a psychiatrist. The ideas of Freud and Adler greatly influenced Viktor Frankl early in his career, but eventually, our hero formulated his own system of thought, which he called Logotherapy. It became considered the third Viennese school of psychotherapy. Viktor primarily worked with suicidal women, but he also had violent patients in his department. By 1937, the young doctor had already opened a private practice. But while our hero was building his career, a shadow gradually grew in the north, in Germany. At the beginning of 1933, the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, came to power in this country. And already in March 1938, Austrian territory was forcibly annexed by Germany. The new authorities began to impose their own rules, and Austrian Jews immediately began to experience problems. Frankl himself, due to his fame, was initially left alone, but many other Jews were deprived of jobs, housing, or simply expelled from the country. The suicide rate, which had always been the main focus of Viktor's psychiatric work, increased significantly. After the conquest of Austria, Frankl worked for a time as a surgeon. He once let a terminally ill man pass away, and on another occasion, he refused to save an elderly man who had taken pills along with his wife. The woman had already died, and Frankl believed it was completely inhumane to bring the old man back to life just so he could attend his wife's funeral. Meanwhile, the Second World War began, and the situation for Jews in the Third Reich became even worse. Many of them now risked ending up in a concentration camp. But in this gathering darkness, Frankl managed to catch a last ray of light. A nurse and a young woman named Tilly Grosser had found a job at the hospital where he worked. The young people fell in love and married at the end of 1941. As Frankl recalled, they were one of the last two Jewish couples to do so. Just a few days later, the registry office for Jews in Vienna was closed. Tilly soon became pregnant. But under German law at the time, pregnant Jewish women were sent straight to concentration camps, so the young family sacrificed their unborn child. However, with each passing month, it became increasingly clear that the vast majority of Jews would inevitably end up in a concentration camp, and then Viktor had a chance to save his own life. As a valued doctor, he was granted an American visa, but the visa was granted to him, and him alone. He would have to leave his loved ones to their fate. In one of his books, he frankly admits that he even considered this for a while. After all, his life was at stake. Then one day, while wandering the city streets, he found himself near the ruins of a destroyed synagogue. His eye fell on a charred fragment with some text written under a layer of soot. Picking it up and looking closer, Frankl saw the first words of one of the 10 Commandments. This remarkable incident helped Viktor gain strength and remain in Austria with his family. A few months later, he, his father, mother, brother, and his wife Tylee were sent to a concentration camp. The concentration camp system began to be built in Germany immediately after the Nazis came to power. In February 1933, a month after Hitler's appointment as chancellor, the so-called Reichstag fire occurred. According to the official version, the arsonist was a member of the Dutch Communist Party, but many believe the Nazis themselves organized the fire, although there is no direct evidence. The very next day, a decree was issued on the protection of the people and the state, which limited freedom of speech, the press, assembly, and the right to private property. The German Communist Party which was supposed to be the Nazis' main competitor in the upcoming elections, was very successfully banned, and several thousand of its members became the first prisoners of the nascent concentration camp system. By 1935, there were 5 camps operating in Germany, which held a total of about 4,000 prisoners, the vast majority of whom were political opponents of the current government. And after 1938 and the events of the so-called Kristallnacht, Jews increasingly became prisoners in the camps. The herbivorous times, when they were simply fired from their jobs or deported from the country, ended. Soon World War II began, and the Nazis, among other things, set about solving the so-called Jewish question. At first, they didn't stand on ceremony. In the occupied territories of Poland, then the Soviet Union and other countries, special death squads operated, searching for and executing the Jewish population. In August 1941, one of the highest officials of the Nazi Party, Heinrich Himmler, visited the recently captured city of Minsk, the capital of present-day Belarus. There, he witnessed a mass execution and realized that the execution of defenseless women and children had a completely different effect on German soldiers than fighting an armed enemy. Even the SS stormtroopers, indoctrinated with propaganda, were psychologically shattered by carrying out such orders. It was decided to find another way to exterminate the Jews, one that wouldn't force the executioners to look their victims in the eye. Frankl and his family were sent to regular concentration camps. They are perhaps the main symbol of the Holocaust, although the majority of Jews died in the 6 death camps established after the Wannsee Conference. Frankl spent 3 years in prison, and during that time, he was essentially in 3 concentration camps. When Frankl arrived at the camp, he had with him a manuscript on logotherapy, a new method of psychoanalysis he was developing. This manuscript and all his other belongings were confiscated with the promise of being returned later. But this was a lie. For Frankl, that night was filled with a particular tragedy. Somewhere beyond the fence, slightly off to the side of the camp, was a guardhouse. The SS men had a noisy drinking session and spent half the night belting out trendy songs. Then, unexpectedly, a violin began to play. At that moment, the morally crushed Viktor began to quietly weep, lying on the filthy bunk in his barracks. The prisoners usually rose at 4:30 a.m. and went straight from the barracks to the lineup. Guards walked between the lines of prisoners, counting everyone and assigning them their daily duties. Experienced prisoners immediately explained to the newcomers that the most important thing at the lineup was to look alert and healthy. If a passing guard decided you were unfit for work, you could be sent straight to the gas chamber within a minute of his arrival. The average workday in the concentration camp lasted 11 hours, usually without breaks. Most prisoners were engaged in heavy physical labor. A few months later, he was transferred to the medical unit, where he became an orderly. While working, he contracted typhus and nearly died. But he still thanked God that he wasn't out in the cold with a pickaxe in his hands at that moment. After the workday ended, the prisoners were treated to dinner. This usually consisted of 200 grams of bread and a bowl of soup with a few small rotten potatoes floating in it. Once a week, after dinner, the prisoners were taken to the shower, and then they had a few hours of free time before lights out, which was at 9 p.m. Some prisoners, no matter how exhausted and tired they were, would leave the barracks in the evening to watch the sun set behind the treetops. In his books, Frankl describes how the hardest thing was the lack of certainty. Anyone entering the camp gates could no longer say how or when it would end. People lost their spiritual support, and moral decline was followed by physical decline. Particularly noticeable spikes in mortality were observed during the week between Christmas and New Year's. However, prison conditions remained unchanged, and at first glance, it was unclear why this was happening. Viktor explained this by saying that just as we believe that we can start a new life with the new year, so too, the prisoners harbored an unfounded hope of being released during these holidays. Sitting in the barracks, he imagined that many years had passed. He had been freed from captivity and was telling students in a lecture about the important lessons of the concentration camp. Viktor convinced himself that this was his personal mission, for the sake of which he must endure all trials. Thus, logotherapy, based on the importance of meaning in life, continued to develop even in the realities of the concentration camp. Over time, our hero began organizing a kind of psychotherapy session with his fellow barracks members. Frankl not only helped those who were otherwise holding up well-found support, but also consoled others whose lives were clearly coming to an end. This is how Viktor recalls it. The first months of freedom turned out to be in some ways more difficult for Frankl than the time in the camps. Viktor learned that he was the only one lucky enough to survive. His father died of pulmonary edema almost immediately after his imprisonment. His mother and brother were killed by the Viennese, and his wife, Tilly, fell victim to the typhus epidemic shortly before the end of the war. In one of his books, Viktor wrote that he initially felt so lost that he even contemplated suicide for several days. But at that moment, he remembered how, in the 1930s, he had revived those who had attempted suicide and convinced them that it wasn't the answer. After that, Viktor's spirit strengthened and he felt a little better. The book was titled Man's Search for Meaning, and in it, among other things, Viktor shared his observations about concentration camp guards. The first were sadists in the strictly clinical sense. Such people were specially selected. Their propensity for violence was very useful in such positions. But according to Frankl's observations, there weren't many of them. The vast majority of guards belonged to the second group. Viktor called them spiritually stupefied. These people weren't themselves prone to violence, but constantly watching the sadists from the first group abuse prisoners, they eventually became so accustomed to the evil that they stopped reacting to it. Most guards did not take jobs in concentration camps because they outright hated Jews. It was simply a comfortable place. The pay was good. You could profit from valuables taken from prisoners, and you didn't have to risk your life at the front. As they say, sorry guys, nothing personal. These individuals sabotaged the violence and tried to make life a little easier for the prisoners, regardless of personal risks. One such example was the commandant of the Turkheim camp, where Viktor experienced his liberation. It turned out that this man, in an atmosphere of utmost secrecy, had been purchasing extra food and medicine for the prisoners from the nearest town for several years at his own expense. According to Frankl, many of the ordinary people who found themselves under the rule of the Third Reich had no opportunity to influence the violence that was taking place. Therefore, shortly after his release, while attending a meeting with generals from the victorious countries, Viktor spoke out against the concept of collective guilt. He argued that as former prisoner number 119-104, he had the right to express such an opinion, and therefore he should have. Millions of people suffered cruelly under the Nazi regime, and now they wanted to take revenge on everyone they could reach. And then along came a certain Frankl. With his understanding and forgiveness, Viktor's relations with former camp prisoners and, in general, with the Jewish communities of Austria, the United States, and some other countries deteriorated. Viktor Frankl ultimately lived to be 92. He married a second time, built a successful career as a doctor, mastered rock climbing, and, at 67, took his first flight at the controls of an airplane. And although Viktor was sometimes called a Nazi pig during these lectures, he consistently adhered to his original position. I thought it was crucial to instill in people the simple truth that no one has the right to commit injustice, even those who have suffered cruelly from it. But this needs to be worked on. It needs to be instilled, otherwise the consequences could be far more serious than a few trampled ears of corn.